was predicting 8 to 7 odds for an Eisenhower win, whereas the actual prediction was 100 to 1. When the predictions proved true and Eisenhower won a landslide within 1% of the initial prediction, Charles Collingwood, the on-air announcer, embarrassingly announced that they had covered up the earlier prediction. Next, we have the century with arguably the most going on, the swinging 60s, baby. The 60s were a very important time for technology, and by the time the decade is over, one can look back to a measly 10 years ago and see just the sheer amount it has advanced. So where do we start? Well, we're going to start right at the beginning, in 1960. In 1960, IBM became the first company to mass-produce transistors. This is an incredibly big deal, because at the time, people were still under acceptance lag. People refused to accept that one day an electronic brain could take over the world. But what exactly are transistors? I've been talking about them along with vacuum tubes this entire documentary and I haven't even explained them to you. Well, transistors and vacuum tubes do exactly the same thing. Transistors were the things that replaced vacuum tubes. Transistors are devices that control the movement of electrons, and consequently electricity. Not only do they start and stop the flow of a current, but they also control the amount of the current. Think of them something like a water faucet, but for electricity. This is incredibly useful. Transistors can both switch or amplify electronic signals, letting you control current moving through a circuit board with incredible precision. This paved the way for electronics to now be built into a much smaller form factor, one that could not even feasibly be made before. I mean, even the size difference is something incredible. To put it in perspective, if a transistor was this big, a vacuum tube would be this big. I mean, try imagine fitting one of those in your mobile phone. Our next step is also in the 60s, but we do have to backtrack a little bit to the 50s. An integrated circuit, or monolithic integrated circuit, also referred to as an IC, a chip, or a microchip, is a set of electronic circuits on one small plate of semiconductor material, normally silicon, which we mentioned earlier. This can be made much smaller than a discrete circuit made from independent components. ICs can be very compact, having up to several billion transistors and other electronic components in an area the size of a fingernail. The idea for the integrated circuit came from a British radio engineer called Geoffrey Dummer. Dummer, not Dharma, when he proposed to integrate a variety of standard electronic components in a monolithic semiconductor crystal in 1952. These ideas could not be implemented by the industry in the early 1950s, but a breakthrough came in the late 1958. 3 people from 3 US companies solved 3 fundamental problems that hindered the production of integrated circuits. Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments patented the principle of integration, created the first prototype integrated circuits, and commercialized them. Kurt Lehovic of Sprague Electric Company invented a way to electrically isolate components on a semiconductor crystal. And Robert Noyce of Fairchild Semiconductor invented a way to connect the integrated circuit components called aluminium metallization, and proposed an improved version of insulation based on the planar technology by Jun Huani. But again, people were slow with accepting it, people were too scared, and people were very uneasy to put it into wide use. And next, in 1961, Russia sent the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. But NASA needed to send a man into space too, but that wasn't possible with a 1-ton computer, and so the integrated circuit was finally utilized. This not only allowed a rocket to be sent into space, but it also skyrocketed the computing industry. Today's smartphones have 2,200 times more computing power and 3 million times as much memory as the NASA Apollo 11 guidance computer. Next, in 1963, we have something completely unrelated to the CPU, but important to computing itself. Douglas Engelbart invented the computer mouse, showcased HTML encoding, which was the precursor to web coding and email, and the starting points for the graphical user interface. We're coming to the end of the 60s now, but we're finally starting to see the computer processing industry becoming what it is today. In 1968, the company Intel was founded by Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, and and then a year later, in 1969, Advanced Micro Devices was founded. These are two companies that today basically dominate this computer processing market, being the only two companies that even have them on the market.
And then the century culminates with one of the biggest events in human history in general, the 1969 moon landings. This was not only a giant leap for mankind, but also a giant leap from where technology was to being able to take a man to the moon. Next, we're travelling to the 1970s. Twenty-first-century historians have portrayed the 70s as a pivot of change in world history. In the Western world, social values that began in the 1960s, such as increased political awareness and political and economic liberty of women, continued to grow. In the United Kingdom, the 1979 elections resulted in the victory of the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher, the first and to date only female British Prime Minister. And while all this is important, our topic at hand also encountered some pivotal changes. So where do we start? Well, we start at one of the biggest milestones to date, with the Intel 4004. In 1971, Intel, with the help of Ted Hoff, introduces the first microprocessor that resembles the CPUs that we have and use today, the Intel 4004. It has 2,300 transistors, performs 60,000 operations per second, and costs $200.
All of that, and it has the same processing power as the ENIAC. Crazy, right?
Next year, in 1972, Intel released their next processor, the 8008. Then after that, in 1974, Intel released the 8080, and it became the standard used in the computing industry. Between the years of 1974 and 1979, Intel released many more processors, including the 8085, the 8086, and the 8088. Then, at the end of the century, Motorola released the 68000, and after 30 years in production, the 68000 architecture is still in use. Later on after its release, the processor is chosen for use in Amiga computers, and the computers of a small startup, Apple Computers. In the 80s, Intel and AMD carried on releasing their respective processors, racing to have the fastest one on the market.
Coming to the end of our timeline, we get to 1993, and Intel released the Pentium processor, the first in a line of Pentium processors that are still in use today, with a 60 MHz processing core and 3.1 million transistors. It cost $800 on release. Crazy to think you could probably pick up the same one for like $20 now. Over the coming years, Intel will release more of their Pentium range, AMD will release more of their own processors, and it will come to a market that we have today. It's one so saturated we have processors with up to 8 cores measured in the ranges of 5 GHz. But where do we go from here? I took you on a journey from the ENIAC to where we are today with phones and things like this, which are tiny. With a size and power difference like that, who can say where we go from here? The real question is, do you think we've got to the scary mechanical brain that they were talking about in the past? That's for you to decide. Thank you for watching.